And so perhaps our friend Ed Griffin can come up and tell us what the cake is all about.
On behalf of the Cake Readers Union Local 104, I'd like to express my gratitude in being here tonight and reading the cake for, I think this is the 5th consecutive year, and it really is an honor, especially for such a distinguished guest. In the interest of time, it's very fortunate that Mr. Grady had an opportunity to give you a very thorough background on the This Is Your Life segment of our honored guest. So I don't have to go into all of that, merely point out a few of the symbols on the cake, and remind you of some of those milestones in General Watt's life. If you examine some of these symbols up here later on, by the way, this cake, I understand, will actually be cut. So if you have digested your earlier dessert, there will be a second dessert. So you'll have to get up here pretty fast to see some of these symbols. Somewhere on that cake there is a stork and a baby, and I suppose that's to remind us of General Watt's early childhood, which you already know from the previous discussion, also from your program. So I won't take time to describe all of this. There's an Indian teepee, and you know what that's all about, and a totem pole. I'm not an expert on totem poles, but I believe the figure in the center is a fertility symbol, and I don't know for sure. Now, there is one thing there that you might find of interest. In the layer right beneath the top layer, there are some cowboys in a fence, and some animals, farm animals down there. And we're reminded that when our honored guest tonight was very young, he spent his summers, in particular, working on the family ranch, and this was near Choctaw, Oklahoma, or I guess in Choctaw, Oklahoma. And I'm told that a fondness for animals has been something which has been retained in later years. I can hardly believe this, but I guess there is a pet fighting rooster, a fighting cock in the house now. There are dogs and cats all over the place. There are horses. I believe the figure is 6 or 7. I've forgotten exactly. Which is it, Mrs. Watt? 7? 7, yes. And in the backyard, she says, which, of course, is more than a backyard. I understand they have a lovely ranch. But there's a story about Ronald that I think you might find interesting. Ronald is named after our governor of California, Ronald Reagan. And I don't know why, but his nickname is Ronald's progeny. And Ronald is quite a romantic figure. Ronald, the horse now I'm talking about. Ronald has a way of having these romantic moods come over him, and apparently there is no corral, no fence, no barn in the world that is able to keep him. And the last time they lost Arnold, there are many other parts of the story that are very interesting, but the climax, as far as I'm concerned, is when they looked all over. They were searching for him in automobile and truck. They even had the airplane up scouting for Ronald's progeny, and they found him. Well, they didn't find him, but finally the zoo called up and said, "You've got a horse, I believe, down here. We hear it might belong to you, and he's wooing the zebras." Now, actually, that doesn't have anything to do with our guest, but this is the kind of life that goes on around the ranch. And this is another aside. I came up to the table here where General Watt's family is seated, and I asked if there was anything humorous about this man. I said, "He's so serious, I can't think of anything funny to say." And they all in one voice said, "You gotta be kidding." Apparently, he's quite a joker. In fact, just the other day, I think it was this morning, everyone's toothbrush was missing, and they all suspect that General Watts is going around hiding toothbrushes as usual. Somebody had all their fresh supply of underwear tied in knots, and he's again the suspect. So now, if you look at the picture on the cover, you'll understand what that Mickey Mouse grin is all about. Well, anyway, elsewhere on the cake, there's a large book which is to remind us of his early schooling and his successes in his educational endeavors. The pillars of justice, I presume that's what they are, holding up the upper level there, remind us that he went to law school. He did become a polo player, as was mentioned earlier by Mr. Grady. And then we come to a small briefcase on the cake, and we discover now that the briefcase might well have been replaced by a small figure of a shark. Anyway, the symbol would mean the same thing. A bride and groom can be found if you look on this cake, and of course that is obvious. We know all about Romeo and other connections. Actually, it's to remind us of the general's courtship. There's another interesting story there. Mrs. Watts tells us that she had worked for a friend of the general's, an associate attorney, and then later was hired by the Looney law firm, and that's not a joke, by the way. That's, as you know, the name of the... And because the general was the junior man on the list, well, she wound up working for him. She was the new secretary, and a romance soon developed. But would you believe that, they say that in modern times, or in times gone past and not too long ago, a young man would try and entice his fiancée or his romantic object to see his etchings or something like that, to take a ride in the car to see the unusual sight of the city from the hilltop, etc. Mrs. Watts tells us that his ploy was to take her out to see his pet goat. And this was really a goat. Apparently he did bring it into town on one or two occasions, and on one occasion they left it in the car too long, and when they went out to pick it up, it had completely devoured his roommate's upholstery. Also, Mrs. Watts tells us that as an excuse for pursuing this courtship, he would pretend to have to work late at the office. And so therefore she would have to work late to take that very important letter, and sometimes he'd be out working out at polo and then have to call her and say, we have something very important that just came up. Can I pick you up and take you back to the office for a little more work? So that's pretty obvious. I don't know how he ever succeeded in law with that, but anyway, it worked. Well, to move along very briefly here, the toy soldiers on the cake remind us of his brilliant military career. There's a photo of himself in China. We're reminded of his service in India, Burma, and China. We see the general's gold star, which reminds us of his success and rise in the military ranks. There's a photo which you also have in your program of the general standing in review of a group of kids marching by and a dog. I suppose that's your dog, isn't it, General? Yeah. That's old Rusty. I was guessing, but I knew from his love of animals that had to be his dog in there. And you may not know the story behind that, but while the general was in charge of the 19th Corps Artillery of the Reserve, he was recognized for outstanding service and achievement. And one of the innovations attributed to him was the establishment of what was called Operation Small Fry. The idea behind this, depicted in this picture here, was to bring the young boys of the men who were connected with the fort there, I believe it was Fort Sill, and actually put them into training for a day or two, issue them helmets and blankets and I guess fatigues, if they could find something to fit them, and some canteen belts, and they'd march around and get a feel of real Army life. And they would live just like soldiers would, which gave them an increased appreciation for the responsibilities of their fathers, and in many cases, I understand, encouraged these young lads to take the military as a career when they grew older. And I can see where that was really a wonderful innovation. The American flag all over the cake is to remind us of the general's increasing concern over the plight of the American Republic and his increasing devotion to the patriotic cause. The airplane on the very top of the cake reminds us of his zeal and love of flying. And there's one more story I'd like to tell you here about this flying business. Apparently, some members of the family would rather ride with the general in his airplane than drive with him in his car, because they say he really can't tell the difference between the two. And you've all heard the story of where a fellow is speeding down the highway, and the patrolman catches him and pulls over in kind of a a sarcastic voice would say, "Hey, buddy, can I see your pilot's license?" Well, this actually happened, and you know what happened. He showed him his pilot's license. And apparently the policeman was so shocked, and then he found it so humorous that he patted him on the back and said, "Well, have a good flight," and that was the end of that. Then there's the family photo, which reminds us of the general's devotion to his family. And again, we're reminded of that image that comes before us as we think of home life. That's described here tonight to me as Grand Central Station. I was told that the house is always full of dogs, cats, roosters, horses, and boys, which sounds like a wonderful combination to me. And so, to conclude all of this, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to remind you of the general's motivation. Getting on a very serious note for just a second, we are reminded that the general has never turned down a case in the legal profession which he felt was an important case, regardless of the individual's ability to pay. And this is undoubtedly out of both a genuine human compassion, but also largely out of his own religious convictions, which certainly must not be overlooked in any tribute to this man. Mrs. Watts tells us, and I quote, "We must emphasize that Clyde is a Christian, having deep reverence for the Lord and His ways. We give God the glory and honor for any gifts or achievements in this man's life or that of his family." And so, ladies and gentlemen, when one considers this man's dedication to his religious convictions, to his wife and to his children, and to the Americanist principles which daily motivate him, I believe that it is truly fitting that this assembly, which is gathered here to honor God, family, and country, should pay utmost tribute to our General Clyde Jefferson Watts.